Good evening. Welcome to this meeting of the Foundation for Science and Technology. Welcome to you who are here with us at the Royal Society this evening, and also welcome to our online participants. And I do say to our online participants, you can see, do go to Slido. If you have questions, we will do our best to ensure in that part of the session that your questions get a fair hearing, not just the people who are here this evening. The title for today's event is How Can R&D Collaboration with Africa Support an Agenda for Sustainable Growth in the UK and Beyond? And I'm delighted that we are having such an international perspective to this FST event, and I'm delighted that it's got a connection with Africa. We really are trying to help contribute to a rethink that's going on. Partly driven by necessity with the big reductions in ODA spend, which have changed the way that we are able to connect with African research, sadly. But it doesn't mean that we should think of ODA as the only way of connecting with Africa through research. And it's set as a challenge of looking at other forms of research partnership with Africa based on mutual respect and mutual exchange. And I know that this feeds into the new strategy being developed by the FCDO. And we're going to hear from three wonderful speakers who, in their distinct ways, I hope will help us understand better the ways in which, in Britain, our researchers and African researchers can work together. Our first speaker, let me introduce her, is Dr. Rhona Mijumbi. She is a renowned health policy analyst. We were just talking about her position as head of the policy unit at the Malawi-Liverpool-Wellcome program, and she's a senior lecturer at the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, which I remember visiting. I remember its pride in the Nobel Prize, which it secured for its work on malaria, I think almost a century ago. And if I may say so, I remember being involved in a decision about its desire to be independent from the University of Liverpool. And so it's great to have a researcher from that institute here. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and good evening to you all. It's a great privilege, really, to be part of this important conversation as we come together to engage in meaningful dialogue at the intersection of many things: research, development, geography, politics, growth, not only for Africa, and not only for the UK, but for our shared global future. Let me begin, with a quote that I like to use. I usually use it to guilt trip people. A quote by Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th president of the USA. He spoke, it was a 4th of July, event in Dakota. And he said, it's not what we have that will make us a great nation, it's the way in which we use it. And I guess, that's something for us to think about. We stand at a critical juncture. On one hand, we face unprecedented global challenges: climate change, food security, insecurity, health crisis, the digital divide, increasing geopolitical, tensions. The list could go on and on. On the other hand, we also hold extraordinary tools: research, innovation, and cross-border partnerships, if I could call them that. And this can actually address these very challenges, challenges which, if left unaddressed, will hinder meaningful development. Now, Africa, it's home to more than 1.3 billion people, and it's poised to play a central role in shaping our future. It's not simply, no longer, it's not simply a recipient of innovation, it's actually a source of ingenuity, resilience, and transformative ideas. And I think we'll hear a lot about that this evening. So the question we must ask ourselves today is this: how can we harness Africa's potential through research and development partnerships that not only support sustainable growth in Africa and the UK, but also advance a broader agenda of global prosperity. I want to reflect on 3 key points that I believe are essential to understanding and enhancing research and development collaboration with Africa. 1, why Africa? 2, why sustainable growth must be a shared agenda. And the third thing I would like to reflect on is how we can actually build strong, long-term collaborative frameworks. So let's start with why Africa. Because to understand the value of collaboration, you must first understand the opportunity, right? So Africa, lots of stories. I hope, we were sharing some stories with a few people before we came in. But Africa is rich in natural resources, cultural depth, human potential. I could go on, but talking about or thinking about human potential, by 2050, this is another 20 years, yeah? Of the additional 2 billion people expected to populate the world, nearly 80% of that will come from Africa, mostly from countries like Nigeria, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Angola, the DRC, Niger. In fact, DRC and Niger will double their populations, in a very short period of time. But you see, this is not just about demographics. Africa is already home to a rising generation of researchers, entrepreneurs, and policy innovators. At the Malawi-Liverpool-Wellcome program, where I spend quite a bit of time, we've already seen some of the continent's brightest minds, The Weber Pax Prize recipient in 2022 was Professor Henry Mwandumba, who's the director at that institution currently and is a globally respected immunologist. In Uganda, where I do a lot of work as well, my team developed the continent's first rapid response service for urgent policy making. And this model has inspired similar frameworks, across the continent with colleagues in Brazil, Canada, and Norway. And that same team now is pioneering AI applications in evidence-informed policy making. Now, those are just 2 examples, but across Africa, there are hundreds of such initiatives. They're innovative, they're locally grounded, but very, very globally relevant. Africa's own strategic vision reflects this momentum as well. The Africa Union's Agenda 2063 and STISA, the Science, Technology, and Innovation Strategy for Africa, they're speaking to a continent that is investing in its own growth. If you also look around closely, many African governments are increasingly prioritizing education, infrastructure, but most of all, creation of innovation ecosystems. Now, this sets the stage for deeper partnerships where UK expertise can align with African ambition to co-create solutions for mutual benefit. Let's also talk about the sustainable growth being a shared agenda. See, sustainable development is not a regional aspiration. It is a global necessity. That makes it a shared agenda, which means it comes, yes, with shared visions, but also with responsibility and accountability. As a scientific leader, the UK bears both opportunity and responsibility to collaborate in solving challenges that affect us all. I'll give a few examples to demonstrate this. So let's talk climate change. Africa contributes the least to global emissions, yet it's among the most vulnerable to their effects. So droughts, floods, you can see this on the news, extreme weather events. These are threatening livelihoods, food systems, and stability. Collaboration on climate-smart agriculture, clean energy, water conservation technologies, this will offer benefits on both sides. The UK's leadership in green technology, combined with Africa's pressing need for scalable solutions, this presents a powerful, alignment of interests. Let's also consider urbanization. We were talking about Kampala just before we came in and how it's quite congested. But if you've been around these African cities recently, in the past decade or two, Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, Kigali, Lagos, name them, they're all experiencing rapid growth. But the infrastructure is really struggling to keep pace, leading to congestion, energy inefficiencies, waste management challenges. And through joint research, I think we can work with African cities to leapfrog, carbon-intensive models and develop smart, sustainable infrastructure. Another key area that, goes without saying is healthcare. Africa carries a disproportionate share of the global disease burden, especially in infectious diseases. These impact not just on health systems, but economic productivity and security. With the UK's deep expertise in medical research and biotech and a growing R&D budget, now over £20 billion annually. Perfect day to be talking about this after the spending review. There's a clear opportunity, clearly, to collaborate on solutions that work for both contexts. But there's a catch, with all of this. With all of these opportunities, it's important to stress that this is not a one-way street. These partnerships must empower African institutions and researchers to lead, not merely benefit from the innovations that shape their future. That is what true sustainable growth looks like, that you have local ownership, you have global collaboration, and shared impact. I'll highlight the last of 3 points that I wanted to. Collaborative frameworks for long-term success are not just blips in time. To be able to realize the opportunities that I'm highlighting, we must work towards, robust, equitable, and transparent frameworks for collaboration. The UK's involvement must not be one of merely providing aid or resources, but rather of building partnerships that are rooted in mutual respect, shared objectives, and long-term sustainability. We must be deliberate about building frameworks that go beyond short-term action. We certainly have lessons from the past, and we now know that long-term meaningful collaboration requires many things, but specifically these 3 things. I've already highlighted the empowerment of local institutions and researchers. African researchers and institutions must be co-creators of knowledge. That means investing in their capacity in education, infrastructure, research leadership, so that they can drive their own agendas and shape their own futures. But then couple this with promoting mutual knowledge exchange and innovation. Partnerships must be genuinely two-way. UK and African researchers should engage in joint initiatives with shared goals, co-developed outputs, and equitable intellectual property rights. See, innovation flourishes when it's collaborative, but also when it's context-specific. The third thing that I want to highlight, and as I wind up, is ensuring policy alignment and government support. Governments on both sides must support research and development collaboration through favorable policies, regulatory clarity, and targeted incentives. This includes everything from mobility schemes. I think, we've all seen the stories about visas, researchers unable to meet, colleagues because of, visas in this era. I guess there are, reasons for it. But we need to think about how this actually works. And that's why I'm talking about frameworks that look at, sustainable practices. So everything from mobility schemes and funding models, again, funding models and structures, funding models where we're still pitting, researchers in Africa against each other, give me a concept, let's see who's better than the other. Who's going to be better? They're all struggling to sort of do some work. How about models that actually think about bringing them together and sharing resources? Funding models and structures, ethics review harmonization, and of course, long-term diplomatic science agreements. So what I'm saying is that the potential for research and development collaboration between Africa and the UK is not just vast, it's actually essential. By combining our strengths, we can drive sustainable growth that addresses our most urgent global challenges, but while fostering shared prosperity. when we invest in research and development partnerships with Africa, we are not just contributing to growth overseas. We are actually investing in a more resilient, innovative, and an interconnected world from which we all benefit and where science and innovation knows no borders. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Rhona, for some very interesting points, and I'm sure we might explore further exactly the innovations emerging from Africa, where indeed it's got scope for leapfrogging over established Western ways of doing things. Now, our next speaker is Professor Ambreena Manji. She has been Professor of Land Law and Development at the University of Cardiff since 2014, and she was, before that, Director of the British Academy's British Institute in Eastern Africa in Nairobi from 2010 to 2014. She has a long and distinguished involvement in African affairs, including as President of the African Studies Association in the UK and co-editor of African Affairs. We're very grateful to you, Ambreena, for joining us. Over to you.
Good evening, colleagues, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you this evening. Apologies in advance if I'm not projecting my voice too well. I'm recovering from my statutory summer cold, so just wave if you need me to shout a little bit more. I've really valued hearing Dr. Mijumbi's insights, and I thought I'd try and expand on some of her thoughts and draw them out further by linking them with what I see as the most salient and important features of the recently published summary of the UK's consultation on a new approach to Africa, which I've read with great interest. Many of you will know that the UK government has committed to a new relationship with Africa, and of course we can have a discussion about the really important point that Africa is not, of course, a country. But the report highlights very clearly that it's committed to genuine partnerships, that it is based on notions of mutual respect, and that it recognises that there's a need to understand how the UK and Africa have changed. So at the end of last year, the Foreign Secretary launched a 5-month consultation to hear the views of African partners, and up until May 2025 this year, there have been really extensive country consultations supported by 25 UK ministerial visits. Many of you will know this. And then there have also been consultations with UK-based diaspora organisations, universities, business leaders, including in the creative industries in the UK. Now, I won't have time to review all of the themes of that summary report, but it seemed to me that it would be interesting for our purposes this evening to draw out some of the key themes that deserve perhaps more attention when the final report and work comes to be published. The need for an emphasis on listening and respect and equality seemed to me to be very well made in the report. For the first time, you see an acknowledgement that this is not about doing to the continent, but it's about thinking along with Africa. And for me, just to historicise this, it's a return to what has been in the past a very proud tradition of African-centred thinking that characterised in particular the immediate post-independence period. And the part of the continent that I'm from, East Africa, was a key location for some of those debates. Some of you may know them as the Dar es Salaam debates. They were led very much from Dar es Salaam campus in Tanzania, and were about the future of African intellectual sovereignty and about the risks, the very real risks that lay ahead of infringement on intellectual freedom. that the Dar es Salaam Declaration of the 1990s has recently been reaffirmed by an annex to the declaration tells us a lot about the recent recommitments of African colleagues in higher education to the pursuit of science by African colleagues in their own right, after years of structural adjustment and externally imposed austerity, which has depleted our institutions to the point of near collapse. Many of you will know this, of African universities in particular. And as the UK consultation recognises, there is now a younger generation seeking to reclaim that academic and intellectual space and to assert its importance to the future of the continent. But also a young generation who are thinking beyond those formal spaces and beyond universities and formal institutions. As any of you who've spent any time in Nairobi recently will know, you're spoiled for choice on a Friday evening with the array of book clubs and gallery showings and creative industry events and performances and so on. So it's a really lively cultural and political ecosystem in a way that I think needs to be read generationally. And the report says a little bit about this. It does acknowledge that there is a generational shift of some sort. But I think in the final work, probably this does need to be emphasized. I hope there'll be more full discussion of the fact that in politics, in education, in culture, in science, there's a very significant generational shift that we mustn't underestimate, in which younger colleagues are asking questions about their intellectual sovereignty, their control of their own ideas, their ability to prioritize Africa's interests in her own right, and then to think secondarily about who would be appropriate partners in that work. That is a very significant shift in the time, even in the time that I've been working as an academic writing on Eastern and Southern Africa. The second theme in the consultation that I thought was important was that there was an acknowledgement that the very significant reduction in ODA spending, for example, was having a very significant effect on civil society groups working on human rights, on inclusion, on peace building. And as a lawyer, I feel duty-bound to point out that many of the civil society groups doing this excellent work are left rather stranded by the disinvestment that is now occurring in these domains. And I would include here really significant work on peace building and on the rights of women and children. I hope that that will find a place in the priorities of the report as well. And of course, there's clear concern about the fact that ODA reduction has had an impact on the UK's credibility and on its reputation. And it, I think, is time for us to think about what it would look like to think beyond ODA and that way of considering working with the continent. Certainly, African colleagues are having that very discussion. What would it look like to achieve some of the things that we need to do, for example, in relation to Ebola outbreaks, without having to rely on partners outside the continent. So very significant work within the continent, partners working with each other. I mean, the most recent outbreak of Ebola is a very good example of that. Was addressed very, very quickly by different African countries working together at pace. Unsurprisingly, the report, and I feel I should highlight this, does acknowledge the very significant barriers to business and to equitable partnerships in research posed by a still dysfunctional visa regime. I worked on this issue when I was president of the African Studies Association, in 2018 to 20, and we published, together with the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Africa and the Royal African Society, a report setting out the very significant difficulties that African visitors face when they want to come to the UK to work, for example, for conferences or to collaborate in scientific projects. And there's been a follow-up report, more recently by the Royal Society, again reiterating how important a facilitative visa regime is. That really does need to change if we're to approach anything like equitable working. And finally, and for me most importantly, there's an acknowledgement of the very real challenges that African countries face in accessing global research and knowledge. UK funding and UK initiated partnerships are greatly valued, and an expanded role in supporting African science is said to be welcomed. Away from short-term UK projects towards much longer-term commitments to co-created work. And here I have to mention that we have excellent examples of how this can be done. So ways that support African colleagues at particularly important stages in their career, that have been initiated by UK bodies and that have now become very much taken for granted parts of our research landscape. So to mention just a few, the British Academy has a very significant international fellowship program which gives mid-career academics an opportunity to expand their academic networks, to have protected research time of 2 or 3 years, and to take part in international research at a point in their careers when their career is in danger of coming to a shuddering halt. We know that the danger point is a mid-career academic. So someone who has perhaps left an African institution to study in the UK to get their PhD, who then returns to an African institution and finds that they have absolutely no capacity for taking that research any further at all. So there's a huge amount of lost research as a result of the imposition of administrative burdens, teaching burdens, and so on. And that mid-career point has long been known to be an important one for an intervention. So the Nairobi process reports, if any of you know of them, are a series of British Academy reports that I think started to be published in the 1980s and still tell us an awful lot that is true about how mid-career colleagues might be supported. And I would commend those international fellowship programs at the British Academy for the work that they do to make this possible. And then the other innovation to mention is work within UKRI, and I think the AHRC is particularly innovative in this regard, in that it allows PIs, principal investigators, to be based in the Global South. And that rebalancing, allowing that to happen, fundamentally rebalances co-creation and the doing of science. It's a very significant part of the thinking of the HRC, and I sit on council, the work of the HRC in thinking about building equitable futures together. Now, that's by no means a comprehensive overview of the themes of the recent consultation, but I did want to pull out what I think are the most interesting features of the discussion in the summary report, because it seems to me important for our purposes this evening that we try to understand both the priorities of the continent and the debates that are going on there, as Rhona has very clearly set out, but also that we are able to think creatively about what it is the UK can contribute in this domain. Thank you all.
Thank you very much indeed for that very interesting review of some of the issues that are emerging. I'm now delighted to welcome our third speaker, Professor Christopher Smith, who is Executive Chair of the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Before that, he was Professor of Ancient History at the University of St Andrews and also served as Director of the British School at Rome. So between them, we have representatives of two British institutes abroad. And if we need fresh thinking on research policy, which has just been called for, we should certainly look to Chris to provide it. Chris, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. It's always an enormous pleasure to come to the Foundation for Science and Technology events. It's on this occasion particularly nerve-wracking because two far more expert individuals have spoken. And what I want to try to do is just to throw out a few ideas that perhaps take us forward in the way that UKRI is thinking about the world that we're operating in, and to begin a conversation about a world in which odour is not playing as large a part, not that it's not there, but it's not playing perhaps as large a part as it did before. The place I want to start, though, and I'm going to speak mostly about UKRI, but I do actually want to start in Africa. So actually what I want to say is, if there's a thesis running through this, is that one of the things that we need to change is an argument which starts from UKRI and then looks out, and rather to start in Africa and then bring that into UKRI. It's, I think, incredibly important that we spend long enough thinking about different narratives that Africa is telling of itself. It's so important that we don't get stuck in a narrative of gloom or of conflict or of all those things. They are true, but they're true in Europe right now. We have no exceptionalism here. And some of you will know that I can't really give any public speech without reading a poem. There's a very interesting poem by Ben UKRI, which is called An African Elegy. And if you get the title, you think, oh, God, I know where this is going, right? An African Elegy. Oh. And instead, he says, there are secret miracles at work that only time will bring forth. I, too, have heard the dead singing. And you think, oh. And then he says, and they tell me that this life is good. They tell me to live it gently, with fire, and always with hope. There is wonder here, and there is surprise in everything the unseen moves. The ocean is full of songs. The sky is not an enemy. Destiny is our friend. It's a wonderful poem in its completeness, and it just reminded me again and again of the fact that when we think about Africa, we should think about richness. Phenomenal capacity in terms of minerals, in terms of natural resources, and in terms of demography, as we've heard. We should think about innovation positively. The WIPO has some really interesting stats which says, okay, if you stack African countries up against European countries, then their index of innovation doesn't look so good. But if you look at how they're performing, given where their economy is, they're outperforming European countries in their innovation index. So there's something really fascinating about how from where you are, you're moving faster. And as we all know, moving faster from where you are is one of the things that we really need to do right now. And it's really important, I think, to think about Africa-centred solutions so that the problems which are being answered are the problems that come from Africa rather than the problems that we perceive that we force on. So as an example, it's very easy, I think, for us to think about things like solar power. It's a great one. There's lots of sun. Let's do solar power. Of course, a lot of solar power is itself, the construction of it, quite damaging in terms of its environmental impact in the bits and pieces that create the solar power. There's a really interesting Innovate project which is co-created with African innovators to produce very, very sustainable solar power energy kit. So you're not only getting things which are doing good in terms of energy production, but they're not having then an effect on the environment, which they would do if they came, they're quite disposable items because of conditions, etc. Our versions were creating a different problem. The African versions are solving that problem and producing energy. So that just to start off, saying, okay, well, let's think about Africa in all the positive ways. And then that takes me to ODA. So obviously, official development assistance is an incredibly important tool that we have used very effectively to support UK universities to engage with problems across the global, majority global south. And it's done great work, no question about that. But I framed it in that way because I think that was what happened. It supported UK universities to do things, which is great. I mean, that's very, very important. But it's not the only way to think about the way that science can be constructed. When one looks at some of the evolution of the ODA programme, and as people who are here will know that I came into my role in International Champion with the first reduction of ODA and the difficulties that arose there. One of the things that emerged out of that was the Ayrton Fund. And the Ayrton Fund was looking very hard at ways of producing a kind of a set of solutions around energy that were really based in creating growth, creating ideas, creating capacity in country. And Ayrton was a big enough and capacious enough fund that it joined things up. And I think that's important because a lot of old ODA, GCRF and Newton, brilliant as it was, were quite discrete small packages. There's something to be said for saying that was a mode of functioning which has value, but another mode of functioning is to take a big challenge and throw an awful lot at it. And you can see that across climate, across health, across demography, across a whole range of things, many of which have been picked out, actually, these are intersecting problems and intersecting challenges, and having more umbrella projects is a very interesting and challenging way of thinking. What would, for instance, an Ayrton 2 in health look like, or an Ayrton 3 in materials? And what in particular would future Ayrtons look like if they respected what I see in, for instance, engagements at the Global Research Council, which I was at in Saudi Arabia recently, where the notion of the distinctions between hard science and, say, arts, humanities and social sciences aren't being made quite as sharply as they sometimes are in the UK, which means that there's a people-centred approach to driving innovation and driving research and science. I think that's quite interesting. Obviously, in order to do that, well, one needs consistency of funding. And for that, the question, it seems to me, that arises is, once you've gone through this sort of argument to say, okay, there's a huge amount that we should be looking to Africa for, not to look at the gap, but look at the richness. And then you think we should actually be looking at these big problems together. Then the question is, why ODA? Why is ODA the mechanism that we decide to use? There are very good things that ODA could do, but we've just heard this government make a commitment in a really tough financial settlement situation, not only for the UK, but really across Europe, into North America, and some of the things that are driving some of the difficulties that we're seeing in countries like the United States of America, across Europe, Australia, is a crunch in the liquidity. This government has made a commitment to put a lot of money into R&D. We can use that money flexibly, and we should use it flexibly. There are some very interesting multilateral opportunities, including American-led global research centres, which have not yet been removed, including other kinds of multilateral fora, Belmont being one obvious example. There are the ways in which we can collaborate with, large elephant in room, Horizon Europe. What is FP10 going to look like if it's about competitiveness? Is it going to look about competitiveness in Europe that has no look to the rest of the world? I don't think it will. Then the argument that we're all going to have is that competitiveness about Europe, or is that competitiveness about the way in which Europe engages with the rest of the world? And Africa would be a very good example. And there are ways of doing that, and doing it equitably on the whole pays well. So this seems to me to take us to thinking about, well, okay, if this is the case, we're going to have to work up to this. There's not huge amounts of grant funding money available. The systems are tight. So where should one look? For stability and consistency that is actually genuinely respectful of opportunity. And I think here, things like the way that universities are looking at partnership, capacity building, and that's also true for SCFC, for instance, which is doing some great capacity building work, MLC doing very important capacity building work, NERC doing important capacity building work. All of our research councils are thinking very much about partnership and growing capacity, not just somebody else's capacity, but our collective capacity. Our collective capacity, that suddenly bursts out of a let's find this pot of money that has a particular badge on it, and then we're constrained by its limitations, into let's look at across our whole budget and see what are the ways in which we can collaborate. So that's my sort of positive. It's an important day for all of us with the spending review announcements, with the strong support for R&D. But I want to say something just to close about some threats. In the world that we are in, it is incredibly important that some of the things that we do when we think about competitiveness and we think about growth in our own countries don't subtly pull the rug from underneath burgeoning economies and innovations that are happening elsewhere. And Ambreena has mentioned one of the ones that I worry about a lot, which is open science. So there is a risk that we start moving back at some of the advantages that open science gave us. That would be very bad. But I think there's something else. My view very strongly has always been that science is not open if it disappears 10 years after it was published. The cost of long-term digital preservation is enormous. We haven't cracked it in the UK and in Europe. We must support others to be able to work for long-term digital preservation too. And we can't have a situation where we find a way that is a solution for us, but isn't a solution for others. And that has broad implications, I think, across the global majority, global south. The second is borders. And there's obviously an easy line, which is to, talk about immigration and so on and so forth. But I wanted to talk about something slightly different, which is there is always a risk when one drives into national sovereignty or national capability and sovereign capability to start forgetting the fact that how much is achieved by jointly co-created centres like the British Institute in East Africa, like the MRC centres, which had done amazing work over decades, and that by being genuinely part of their environment, located properly in their environment and respectful of it, they've done great things. They're not national capabilities. British School at Rome and the British Institute in East Africa have that name in their title, but I think it would be a case of both of them and the other international research institutes that they belonged to an international community. And we must hold that notion of international capability very dear. Thank you.
Can I invite all of our speakers up onto the panel now, please? Good. So we now have an opportunity for questions, both from you here in the hall and also for our online participants. I've got my Slido page open to see what's coming in. Perhaps I could just start the ball rolling by asking Rhona and then others to comment on the point you made about innovation in Africa, which is, oddly enough, this is London Tech Week. There are lots of innovators and funders of innovation around. And I can't remember, it's all become a bit of a blur, but there was definitely, I remember in the last few days, a conversation. I think we were talking about some particular area of innovation. I think it was the mobile phone as a diagnostic device. And it's been around as an idea, but more than that, it's been around as a technology for a time. And there was a discussion about where it would actually take off, where it was most likely to become widespread and drive further innovation. And the immediate answer was Africa. Someone said there's less incumbency, there's less existing structures. It's exactly just as Africa led the way in use of mobile phones for financial transactions, it was next going to lead the way in mobile phones for medical assessments and delivery. And first of all, I was wondering if that was your kind of analysis and if you have other examples on what this means for the way in which Africa and the UK can partner in research and development.
Thank you. So that's one way of thinking about the innovations. I think a lot of tech and tech in context, so being able to meet gaps and challenges that are specifically for Africa. So if you look at the mobile phone and you look at, say, mobile banking, I'll use mobile banking especially, you will see that it grew by leaps and bounds in Africa a whole lot faster than it did elsewhere. But this is to fill gaps that, other approaches had not met. So if you look at real banking, if you step out of mobile banking and look at the original formal banking, we have a banking hall and all of that. A lot of it, even now, several Africans would not be able to access. And yet what they need to be able to move things around and move monies around, mobile banking has quickly, taken care of that. And so you find many innovations coming in to fill gaps. And not so much to catch up on a journey that they'll come and help us do the banking the way it was, but really catch up. And you'll see that in many of the innovations. But so you have many groups really thinking about real-time issues. There is a group in South Africa, and I forget what their name is, but they were looking at how they must be in one of the universities, and I might be wrong, but it might be the University of Willetts. And they were looking at how, newer technologies are coming into the world, but there's actually no capacity in Africa. So everybody will move fast. We're growing capacity elsewhere, and everybody will move fast, but we cannot catch up in terms of that capacity, And even then, when you think about the models of how we can grow that capacity, it's then to bring, the people with the expertise from the UK to come and train, and how many can they train at any one given point? How can you propagate that? So it began with one gentleman who is an AI and tech expert, and he said, look, we can't be looking elsewhere. Can we do something within ourselves? And so they began I could call it almost like a Go Fund of expertise. Come with me. And then, they're running small summer camps. They're running maybe 8 weeks within the capacity that they have, the monies and resources. And then it's propagated. And I think over the last, about 5, 6, 7 years, they've actually been able to reach as many people, so many people that they probably would not have with, a more conventional way of doing things. So when you're thinking about, innovation, especially in Africa and for Africa, it's not, the tech alone and the new shiny tools, but even how we are innovating in terms of approaches to challenges that we have, thinking critically about what is it that's missing and how can we fill it in a way that's sustainable for Africa and not, the small blips we're saying, where we can actually fly in as much as we can, but then it can't go beyond, so long.
Right, that is a very fair point. Now let us see if there are any interventions here. Yes, the microphone is coming your way, and if you give your name and organisation, that'd be brilliant.
Hello, thanks so much for everything which has been told so far. Marie Rodet from SOAS. I work on culturally competent AI with startups in Africa, especially in Kenya. And we're trying to raise funding, of course. And that's a question also for people also around here when it comes to funding landscape in the UK and UKRI in particular, and the limits on having non-UK based businesses as international co-lead on projects. So for example, this AI startup I work with, there is no way I can have them as a co-lead, international co-lead on my projects. I can only have them as subcontractors, which is of course in terms of international equitable partnership, when we know that research and development is mostly being driven by the private sector these days in Africa. It's of course a problem.
Thank you. Christopher, do you want to comment on that?
I think it's a very genuine challenge that you're making. We operate in the rules that we operate in. There's a process by which we challenge those rules. I think I would say, let's not forget Horizon Europe again. There are Pillar 2, Pillar 3 opportunities we should perhaps be thinking about harder. Just at the moment, I think it's really important that UK universities really get going with Pillar 2 and Pillar 3. So that would be something to look at. But I think there is a general issue now about what the new funding models which we're being encouraged to take on, British Business Bank investments, pension funds and so on and so forth, what they do to the innovation landscape generally. And I think that I would say that is a very reasonable question to ask of us. I can't give you the answer right now, but I hope I'll certainly take it away and think about it. I think it is always important to remember that UKRI is big, but it's not a monopoly. And you don't really want a monopoly. So let's always remember what else is out there. If we can crowd more private funding alongside some of the things that we're talking about, then it's actually got to be a good outcome. So yes,
And just to clarify, when you say Horizon, you think some of the constraints are less severe if it's Horizon?
There are consortial opportunities that I would imagine actually probably do permit you to think a little differently from the way that Innovate works. You might end up having to rethink the project because of the way that it's constructed, but maybe, and I'm not for a moment suggesting you haven't thought about that, but it's worth a look, I think. Yeah. And remember that Horizon Europe's going to change quite a lot too over the next little while, so we need to track.
And also, I would add that after painfully negotiating that we were back in Horizon, the money that we thought we would be spending through Horizon, we are not, British academics, British researchers are not applying the Horizon funding on the scale that was expected.
Especially businesses. Especially businesses, actually. And I think that one of the challenges is that academics are, it's interesting. Some of the academic results in ELC are pretty good. And we had the guarantee, and the guarantee did a certain job very well. I think business confidence in the process has been dented. And that's perhaps where combinations of innovation, business and universities may be able to do more.
Right. Rhona, do you want to comment on that? Right. Sorry, I don't know if you're drinking or saying you don't need to comment, because Ambreena has said that she doesn't wish to comment on that because we've got another question, but he's just... Right, okay. There's another question right at the back there. And then I'll go to one or two online interventions. Yeah.
James O'Mahony, the Zoological Society of London. We have Western finance ministers worrying at the moment about the decline of our populations and their revenue stream in terms of tax and employment, of course. I don't think the rapid growth of populations in Africa is anything for us to be sanguine about, because when you look at the possibility of the continent feeding the population without further farming what was the wilderness, it's the elephant in the room, or maybe it's the elephant for which there is no room. That the population of Africa is going to be sustainable has to be a serious concern, don't you think?
Yes, Rhona, yes, there's a lively debate about kind of exactly where the demographic transition is in Africa. We might, anyway, you commented, I noticed you were quite optimistic. Do you think it's a challenge?
Well, it is a challenge. We can't run away from that. But do we then stay with the doom, or do we try and find out how we harness this? Is there a way in which we can turn what looks like a challenge into something that we can use? Can we use these demographics to our advantage? Because to be able to turn them, hopefully something will happen eventually. But before that happens, what do? Do we look on and say, well, it's doom and gloom? I think the message here is more of harnessing that demographic dividend, more than, worrying. And not to say we shouldn't worry. Yes, resources are not infinite. They're not finite. So, but as we work towards that, is there a way in which we can harness this, to our advantage? I think that's the message.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps we should incentivize some sort of constraints on population growth, like Mrs. Gandhi did in India in the 60s.
Whatever we choose to do, it won't turn, at least not in the next 10 years. So what do we do with what we have then? Can we harness it?
I'd be concerned that nature doesn't come and get its own back. If people don't, if the human population isn't constrained.
Well, I think let's not get into population constraint this evening. That may be for another occasion. There's a policy debate around it. But I just wonder, Ambreena, do you want to... this issue of African demographics, and of course there's an opportunity, this surge in the number of young people, but also absorbing a surge in the number of young people is a massive challenge. It's probably where the Arab Spring was, because they weren't being absorbed.
But of course, pitting population against nature in this way is entirely unhelpful. The important point is that there is no pure nature. It's been intervened upon. I work on land issues, and one of the major problems facing, certainly Eastern Africa, and of course also the South, is that land is held in, huge concentration by a very small number of people. So that those people who are dependent on land for their livelihoods just are getting less and less access. And there isn't a debate about redistribution of land or about who's holding land in which ways, that there are, in Kenya, enormous millions of acres worth of land held in ranches, for example, that don't apparently add to food security in any meaningful way, but are internationally promoted and supported. We have to have those discussions, I think, before we ever have any discussion about population. I don't think that's where the productive debate lies.
Just one tiny thing, which is just to say, we can really see agri-tech beginning to develop in very interesting ways. And of course, the benefits for understanding the agriculture of Africa are not only intrinsic to that agriculture, but that some of the climate in some parts of Africa will become the climate in some parts of the rest of the world. When you get the agri-tech right there, then there will be spillover benefits for others in due course. And, that might be grim from a certain point of view, but on the other hand, it is precisely a kind of opportunity that one can think about.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Now I'm going to look at some online questions, and actually there's a couple, but I will start with Christopher because they are UKRI linked. So one question is, are UK research councils confident enough to prioritise African countries now over traditional priority countries like the USA and France? So there's a punchy question which Chris, I'm sure, will be able to comment on. But there's a second which I think may have been prompted by your very interesting remarks about things like data access and data storage. Given how unaffordable publishing is, e.g. the introduction of processing fees, when we thought we were going for open access, in what ways do you envisage overcoming research access barriers? So sorry, Chris, I think they're both up. Then I'll invite Rhona and Ambreena.
On the first one, the confidence issue, I've got I could have done reeling off lots of really exciting projects. We've got the BGS here, which is doing terrific things. STFC investing very heavily in partnering projects. MRC done that for years. We have a Global South project on gender-based violence. We could have done a gender-based violence in Europe, but we actually wanted to do gender-based violence in the global majority and then see what we could learn. And actually, I'm rather pleased that we did, because now we've got Safer Streets as a domestic mission. We've already got a set of rather interesting innovations and thinking and so on and so forth, which we can pull across. So I think the confidence is there. I mean, clearly, it's important to invest appropriately in any research project. I guess that I would say that what we shouldn't be looking to do is invest at the same level in new countries as we did or do in the United States of America, but what we should be doing is making sure we diversify and we create stability that allows there to be a gentle growth which is sustainable over time. And that's, I think, what we will find ourselves gently doing over coming years, almost because there is a huge advantage in being a first mover or a relatively first mover in a new area. In regard to publishing costs, I mean, this is clearly an absolutely enormous problem. I am one of those who believes that part of the solution has to be to work with major publishers, not to assume that we can just do without them. I get that there is an argument that says, well, you know, if all the big five just disappeared, then the world would be a happier place. I don't think we're going to get that immediately, and I think that there's a process that we need to go through. We have to understand the levers that we have. But of course, one of the things is that as we bear the cost often of some of the processing charges in richer countries, the critical thing is making sure that in due course, at any rate, some of that science is available, and that's where paywalls, et cetera, come, as long as you have well-founded libraries. I also think co-creation of articles, etc., co-writing co-authorship is a very important way forward, and maybe we should all be thinking about how our co-authorship practices bring open access through, with the burden falling where predominantly the riches are. Right. Those are partial answers to an immensely complicated question.
Thank you very much. Ambreena, do you want to comment on either of those points?
I mean, just to endorse Christopher's point about co-authorship and the importance of, we know how well co-authored work does in terms of its visibility and its impact. But we should also not fall into the trap of imagining that just because the science isn't visible in the places we would normally look, that it isn't being published. So there is a very, very vibrant African publishing scene on the continent by university presses, that didn't exist even 5 years ago. So, in my own discipline of law, there are really very significant law presses now working on the continent, publishing excellent work by colleagues from an early career stage all the way through to professors. And that work deserves attention. So, you know, there's research going on, it's just not in the places we're looking for it. And another good example of that is that if you really want to do a project, you know, for example, on AI in Kenya, when I was at the British Institute, the first thing I would do to say to a new researcher is, well, go to the university library and just have a mooch around the shelves and look at what the master students have written on. Because that's where the cutting edge stuff is done. And then it's never seen again. It's deposited in the library, the person moves on. But there are fantastic ideas and fantastic projects that just flourish briefly and then never really come to anything. But there's work and research in all kinds of places. We just need to be sensitive about where we look.
Rhona, your comments, especially after all with the extraordinary linkages in the research programs you're involved with. Your observations on particularly that issue of international partners.
Yes. First, I wanted to add something small on. There was a question about, you know, are you ready to work with, you know, the unconventional partners?
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Africa in this case.
Making priorities.
Exactly. And I think the discomfort that brings the question of, are you ready to do that? You know, it comes from us viewing things from within the current frameworks. And I think, you know, when we're saying, is there a way in which we can frame Africa differently?
Yeah.
For us to begin to say we are comfortable, you know? And it's the same thing when whatever we want to think about in this case, that there's a need to review how we view and frame things in a way that allows for new thinking about this particular partnership, but partnerships in general. What are those variables that will make you comfortable or that are making you uncomfortable? And what kind of framework, you know, or what kind of framing, you know, brings that sort of thing? So if you're framing Africa as a recipient, yes, you're definitely going to say, you know, is this in place? Is this in place? Is this in place? It's not in place, I'm hesitant. If you're viewing them as a partner, you know, what are the things that should be in place? And therefore, you know, you're thinking, do we have shared objectives? Because then in the original framing, it's your objective, right? You know? Here we're saying, you know, what is this thing we want to work on together? What do you bring? What do I bring? You know, it's not, I'm bringing everything, and so I'm uncomfortable, and I need to know where it's going. But Africa is also looking and saying, do you have what, you know, it takes to take what I'm bringing, you know? So if we begin to reframe and review how we have put these frameworks in place, the question of, are you comfortable, will probably tone down, because then you begin to also see yourself in a place of, do I bring, do they bring, you know? Can we have this shared sort of relationship?
Very good. Thank you. Oh, yes, Chris.
Have you, just a tiny little thing. I mean, just an example. It's not just an Africa thing. It's something that's quite rooted in the way we think. Co-to-tell. Nobody finds co-to-tell very easy. In my experience, what happens is the whole notion of the way that you set up partnership frameworks for somebody else, and it doesn't matter whether it is in I've done it in France as well as other countries. You start from a position of mistrust.
Yes.
You have a quality assurance framework where the kind of initial thing is, are you good enough to work with us? And we have our, you know, we're right. Are you doing things in a way that's right enough for us? And that is the way that we constructed our quality assurance, which is why co-to-tell is such a pain, because you spend all your time trying to find the thing you've got in your place in another place that does things in a very different way. I think there would be amazing opportunity if we actually took the model of co-to-tell and started thinking very differently about it and actually thought about it in consortium terms. So we didn't go institution by institution for that and had efficiency of practice. What would we lose? What would be the cost? It would actually be a huge gain.
Thank you, Christopher. Radical as ever. I think we've got some. I might take a couple of questions. Let's start here.
Thank you. Ehsan Masood from Nature. I have a question for you, Lord Willetts.
I'm not sure that's allowed.
I'm sure you can make an exception. Really, I think it's just to help us all to understand the sort of the evolution of the use of odour for research. Because my understanding is that the government, of which you are a very distinguished member, because of your commitment, or your government's commitment to the 0.7% target, meant that every year, as our economy grew, we had additional money which needed to find a home. And this building and the British Council in Manchester and the British Academy over the road were suddenly asked to assist in the disbursement of said funds. Is that an accurate understanding of what happened?
Well, you're remembering anecdotes that, well, I mean, very, very brief. I think there were two factors at work, and which may be relevant to this evening. The first was, I remember, there were an awful number of MOUs. There were an awful number of research partnership MOUs that were signed as ministers in various departments and various governments went around the world. And very little then happened.
Yeah.
And I think actually Paul Nurse, when he was president of the Royal Society, just said, this is just getting absurd. We're all going around, and they were starting sending me off to sign these MOUs. He said, there's no money in them, so they're pretty bogus, really. So Paul set me the challenge of trying to do something that meant the MOUs were real. So that's what planted one kind of seed in my head. And then the other thing that happened, and you're right, I can remember the particular instance. So when George Osborne, those are the days when I was having a gossip with him, and he was saying, I've just got my new economy forecast for the autumn statement, and it's showing the economy bigger than we'd previously forecast. So the 0.7% is going to require a bigger ODA spend. But he did say, and I don't trust DFID to spend it all in the way, very well. And in fact, I'm going to come and ask a question of Ambreena to pass this on. And he was saying, so I've got all this ODA money. And so I thought, we were chatting, he was just commenting, he'd been reading those papers. I think we were on an overseas trip and he found it in his box. And I said, well, I can find you some ways of spending ODA that doesn't involve going through DFID. There's research things we can do with developing countries for ODA that we can run out of the science part of BEIS, doesn't need to go through DFID. And we started with the Newton Fund that way, which was the first ODA spend on research partnerships. And I thought Christopher was slightly hard on it. I think actually it was based on genuine mutuality. The whole idea was that we put in money and another country brought in a matching amount of money, and they were shared research programs, and they certainly were aimed at reaching out beyond the conventional partners. So we did Nigeria, South Africa, Indonesia.
Think that's very fair on Newton. I think that's very, very fair.
I think in a way, the way I would pass it on to Ambreena in particular, because I think your observation, what was the frustration with DFID? And certainly part of my frustration with DFID was that the DFID education and research had very little interest in research partnerships at all, and their educational interest was solely in early years and primary education. And I remember there a conversation with Naledi Pandor from South Africa, who really got quite angry. She said, when you decolonize, when you left countries, you often left us with some quite strong universities and then provided them with no further support. And I remember another minister from another developing country saying, why is it, of course we want all our girls to go to primary school, we understand that. But why are you absolutely refusing to train any geologists? Do you just want us to be weak when we're dealing with Western mining companies? Why is your sole use of DFID money getting people into primary education? Are we not to have a people who can negotiate back? And I have to say, so Ambreena, I'm going to turn to you because you were commenting on the state of hygiene. I have to say, I think, and the World Bank shifted its thinking, the World Bank evaluation of returns for developing country from education shifted before DFIDs did. Initially, the evidence was getting literacy and numeracy was the high return priority. Everything else was secondary. The World Bank's assessment showed increasing returns to secondary and tertiary education, and DFID was very slow to cotton on to that. And I think that's one of the reasons why, sadly, the higher education institutions suffered for decades. But I don't know, do you want to comment on that?
Well, a few points. I mean, the real innovation with 0.7 GNI was that for the first time those ODA funds were spread across Whitehall. I mean, that watching it at the time, that was...
And that was definitely part of the Chancellor's objective.
Yeah. And that was, deliberately done, and I think really very, in a really interesting way, that I think could have been a model for others. And I published on it at the time because I thought it was so interesting to watch. My criticism of the way that was done, when the funding eventually did come into our institutions and our universities, is that very often we were forced to, and for understandable reasons, but it did cause us problems, we were always forced to work to very short deadlines. So there was a lot of reputational damage entailed in the fact that UK academics were writing to, for example, African partners saying, I want to make this bid for £1 million, need to put it in by tomorrow, send me your CV now. Now, that is no way to develop meaningful relationships. Now, that wasn't always the case. There was excellent GCRF work done. But in many instances, it caused a lot of offence because we were just not in a good position to do long-term work to then say, well, look, who do we want, how do we want to create a project together? That's important.
Yeah,
now,
no, I agree. No, it should be a start. And we tried to have stable friendship, but it wasn't always possible.
It wasn't always possible because the timelines just didn't always work in our favour. Now, with regard to African institutions, there is, I think, a conversation about, when Britain was, departing or thinking she may depart from some of her colonies, she deliberately discouraged the founding of universities. Universities were going to be filled with people who were going to be difficult and problematic and make demands. And so, for example, in Ghana, there was a long battle to create a University of Ghana because this was not at all in the interests of Britain. Now, subsequently, we had created, in that kind of cusp colonial period, really successful university institutions. And I would name here Nairobi University, I would say Ghana. I'm not even going to talk about the South, but certainly Nairobi would, Dar es Salaam in its way, Makerere in its day. But there's a story to be told there about the way in which African governments themselves are then disinvested from those universities. So the fault doesn't only lie with DFID. I agree that DFID's priority was always early years. But there's also a conversation to be had about how African governments were never encouraged to support their own institutions and to invest in science themselves. And in that, they really significantly failed, and didn't just encourage and deplete these institutions, but actually, in many cases, attacked them. Yeah. So some of our best academics and scientists are abroad.
And the tragedy. I remember the previous director of the LSE started his career or made part of his career as a professor in the University of South Sudan, which just tells you how these things change. I don't know if you had a comment before. No. Because we are getting a bit tight for time, and I saw there were several other questions here. So I think what I'm going to do now is go around. I think there were hands up in several places. Yep, we'll start there, and I think a couple of others as well. Yep.
Thank you. Susie Kitchens from Imperial College London. So I want to just tap back into that theme of optimism. Absolutely share that. I've spent 6 years in East Africa, and the innovation there is really heartening and exciting. Then 3 years at DSIT, working closely with Christopher's team on building the International Science Partnership Fund, really trying to embed those equitable partnership principles, which should be standard across any kind of collaboration. I don't think that's Africa-specific at all. And now at Imperial, I'm immersed in the international ambition, and there's some incredibly exciting work going on around genomics. And this is not ODA, this is just great science. So, there happens to be a lot of malaria across Africa, so it's understandable that the partnerships are rich there. But gene drives, looking at CRISPR technologies, looking at sickle cell therapeutics, looking at plant-based vaccine manufacturing. I mean, this is all stuff that we can't do alone. We do bigger, better science when we do it in partnership. My worry, and sorry, I'll get to my question, is where we're going to butt up against problems with this pull-through of novel science is around the regulations and the legislation. So what should we be focusing on collectively in science diplomacy to ensure that those kind of international standards don't prevent the good science from developing?
Very interesting. What I'm going to do is collect a couple more interventions, and then we'll give our panelists their final response. Yes.
My name's John Lowe, Institution of Mechanical Engineers, Worshipful Company of Engineers, etc. I declare a vested interest. I've lived and worked in Nigeria in an engineering manufacturing environment, so I'm particularly interested in the future of the continent and Nigeria in particular. The particular point is this evening's consideration is about R&D collaboration with the UK and Africa. Recognising the Belt and Road reach out by China, if I'm a benign dictator in an African country, isn't it more attractive to go and embrace the offers from China? I would like to think that in the long term that's not the case, but the views of the panel would be very helpful.
Right, the China angle, very good angle, we hadn't covered before. And then at the back, yeah, the back. And then I think there's no other hands going up. Right, final question.
Mike Short, former Chief Scientific Advisor, Department of Business and Trade. I'd just like to comment on the question in terms of, from an industrial point of view, there must be some levers that can be pulled with industry to improve R&D collaboration. I'd point to the statistics for May. 36 startups in Africa announced a total of $254 million raised last month alone, or 2.5 billion over the last 12 months. How do we get more of that industrial collaboration working internationally, perhaps where investors play a part? Maybe it's a question of less competition between African countries and learning from the best. Some of the leading ones were in Egypt, for example, rather than in sub-Saharan Africa. So how do we take some lessons into this collaboration zone with industrial and investment help?
Thank you very much. Let's start with Christopher and work along the panel. So this is your kind of final moment. We've got 3 specific questions about regulations, about China, about the business angle and startups. And I hope by the time all 3 panelists have commented, we've answered all 3 questions. But any other final observations as well? Christopher first.
I absolutely agree that ISPF was a very, very important step in evolution. I always thought we got hung on the fact that we were so stuck trying to get it right in itself that we never broke it open to co-funding sufficiently. And that's a UKRI problem as well. UKRI then looks at the sum of money it gets and uses it as well as it possibly can, never really drives to get more money. And I think that co-investment point is going to be increasingly important. Maybe we've been given some of the tools for it. In terms of regulation, that's one of the reasons why I'm very keen that we start talking about international capabilities rather than national sovereign capabilities, because in some ways, one of the only ways in which one might be able to see that through easily is by bringing people together in an institution where the data can flow within that the institution. But I said that closing of science is one of the things I worry about most. It's not an Africa thing, it's a global thing. I think you're right. I think science diplomacy needs to set itself against that. In relation to the prominence of China in Africa, well, my view on China is sort of in that middle of the river that we always try to find ourselves in, which is that it's pointless to ignore China. We need to be able to find the places where our collaboration with China can actually drive good behaviours, if at all possible. There is a very interesting collaboration which has just been signed between Kew and Chengdu University. It's really exciting. The things that could be done, it's an example of how partnership could probably be really beneficial. So I suppose my Pollyanna-ish answer perhaps I can do the negative if we want, but my Pollyanna-ish answer is let's find places where we can work and build small steps forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Rhona?
Yeah, I think I'll put it together because, I see a string in all of it. Mm-hmm. And for me, in a recent conversation, we're talking about how collaboration and partnerships really start well until the politics, gets involved. And I think for many, technical partnerships, unfortunately, there's, when it gets to the point where now things need to start getting exchanged, including, resources and moving around, you can't run away from the politics. But I think that's where, we again, for me, it's really reframing things, that we move from, I think, an angle that's usually abused and used in more ways than it should be, is the security angle, whichever way, health security, something security. And, when you start talking about international regulations, the first thing, people are thinking about, because of the framing that is mistrust more than anything else, is security more than diplomacy. Mm-hmm. So you're thinking health security, more than health diplomacy. You're thinking, let's talk about AI. You're thinking about cyber security rather than cyber diplomacy, And if we begin to change the way we frame things, then some of these regulations, will either tone down or things like that. And that applies for all the geopolitics that we're thinking about when we say, how we're thinking about China in these spaces. Again, it just goes back to diplomacy versus security for me.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, just a few points on regulation. I mean, I think we need to think really hard about the regulatory framework that follows innovation. So a good example of that is the M-Pesa digital payment system in Kenya. The Kenyan government made a deliberate decision after it was created to regulate it not as a banking app system, but as a telecommunications app. And that gave it, a good decade in which to really take off. Now, that was a very deliberate decision. I mean, I thought there were risks involved. As it turns out, it gave it the space that it needed for that innovation to really succeed. And that was a very deliberate regulatory decision. So that the regulatory framework around an innovation is incredibly important to think about. On China, I mean, I would urge any of you who are in Nairobi in the near future to visit the engineering department and to look at the refurbished teaching classrooms and to look at what some of the students are able to study there. They're able to study engineering and Mandarin as a dual degree in beautiful classrooms with all of the best facilities, with the most cutting-edge engineering curricula that you can possibly imagine. That's the kind of work China is doing in its education diplomacy. Really significant work. And then finally, on industry, I completely agree. I think that the problem that we face on the continent is that there is, rather than harnessing the strengths that we have as, for example, regional trading partners, we constantly fall out with each other and mistrust each other. So Kenya won't talk to Tanzania or Tanzania is suspicious of Kenya because we're seen as the bigger partner. All of those things get in the way of significant, intracontinental work with industry on precisely the sorts of startups and innovations that you're mentioning.
Thank you very much, and thank you to our panel. Thank you for your questions, physically here and online. And I do think that, of course, there are challenges, but I think we also discerned great reasons for optimism and informed with mutual respect and growing mutual trust. I think there is now an enormous opportunity for genuine research and innovation partnerships between the UK and African countries. And I hope that is the conclusion we've reached this evening. And if you want to feel even better, there's a glass of wine next door and some canapes. So I hope our guests will be able to stay for a while and enjoy that. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Good. Thanks.
You want to close it?